There are moments scattered across the dusty pages of frontier history when fate intervenes in ways so perfect and unexpected that they seem written by an invisible hand. Moments when a lonely soul performing a simple act of mercy unknowingly sets in motion events that will transform not just one life but several, proving that sometimes our greatest destinies arrive not through grand plans, but through small choices made with compassionate hearts. In the unforgiving wilderness of the Old West, where isolation could drive men to madness, and where the distance between settlements meant that help was often days away when it was needed immediately, one solitary rancher would discover that the line between saving others and being saved yourself is far thinner than anyone imagines. Picture a man riding alone across empty grassland on a cold autumn afternoon. A man who had grown so accustomed to solitude that he barely remembered what it felt like to hear another human voice in his own home, scanning the horizon not for company, but simply for landmarks that would guide him back to the ranch house, where he would eat a silent meal and sleep a dreamless sleep before rising to repeat the same lonely cycle the next day. Now picture that same man hearing something that did not belong in that empty landscape. The sound of children crying, small voices calling for help from somewhere beyond a rise in the land. A sound so unexpected that at first he thought exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. What he found when he followed those cries would shake him from the numbness that years of isolation had created. Two little girls no more than 4 years old huddled together for warmth beside the wreckage of an overturned wagon, their parents nowhere to be seen, their faces streaked with tears and dirt, their small bodies shaking with cold and fear, and the terrible knowledge that they were alone in a vast and dangerous world. The rancher's decision in that moment to gather those children into his arms and carry them to safety would seem like simple decency, the only choice any human being could make when faced with such need. But what he could not know as he wrapped them in his coat and turned his horse toward home was that the next day would bring a knock on his door that would change everything, that the mother of those twins would arrive carrying her own burden of grief and desperation, and that together these three lost souls would create something neither had thought possible anymore, a family forged not from blood or tradition, but from the raw materials of survival and second chances, and the stunning discovery that even the loneliest heart can be awakened when given reason to love again. The year was 1882, and the territory of Montana stretched out in endless grassland broken by rocky outcroppings and distant mountains, a landscape of harsh beauty that demanded everything from those who tried to tame it and gave back only what could be wrested from it through backbreaking labor and stubborn persistence. The small settlement of Copper Bend sat at the junction of two trails, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings serving the scattered ranches and homesteads that dotted the surrounding country, offering the basic necessities of frontier life including a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and little else. About 12 miles from Copper Bend, in a valley where a small creek provided reliable water, stood the ranch of a man named Joseph Edward Carter, called Joe by the few people who spoke to him. A spread of about 1,800 acres where he ran cattle and horses in numbers that one man working alone could barely manage. Joe Carter was 36 years old and had been living alone on his ranch for the past 7 years, ever since the death of his wife Mary from complications of childbirth that had also taken the son they had been expecting, their first child, the baby who was supposed to have made them a family. The double loss had broken something fundamental in Joe, had stolen not just his loved ones, but also his capacity for hope and his interest in building anything beyond bare survival. He had withdrawn into himself after Mary's death, severing the friendships he had begun to form in the community, refusing invitations to social gatherings, speaking only when absolutely necessary to conduct business, creating a life that was functional but empty, maintaining his ranch and his body, but allowing his soul to wither from lack of nourishment. The ranch house that had once been filled with Mary's laughter and singing now stood silent and cold, its rooms cleaned only enough to be sanitary, its walls bare of decoration, its atmosphere more like a work camp than a home. Joe would rise before dawn each day, work until exhaustion claimed him, eat whatever simple food required minimal preparation, and sleep a sleep that was rest but never peace, haunted by dreams of what might have been if Mary had lived, if their son had drawn breath, if he had not been left alone in a world that seemed to have no further purpose for him beyond the grinding repetition of daily labor. Joe's isolation had deepened gradually over the years until it became his defining characteristic, the thing that people mentioned when his name came up in conversation, the lonely rancher out by Copper Creek who never came to town except when absolutely necessary, who never spoke more than a handful of words to anyone, who seemed determined to live out his years as a ghost haunting his own property. Some people pitied him while others judged him as strange or weak for not moving past his grief, but most simply forgot about him, except when they happened to see him on one of his rare visits to Copper Bend. And then they would nod politely and leave him to his solitude, because clearly that was what he wanted. On a cold afternoon in late October, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and as the temperature was dropping toward a freeze that would coat everything with frost by morning, Joe was riding the northern boundary of his property, checking fences and looking for any cattle that might have wandered too far from the main herd. The work was routine, and his mind was mostly empty, thinking about nothing in particular, simply moving through the motions that filled his days with activity that kept despair at a manageable distance. He was perhaps 5 miles from his ranch house, in an area where the grassland gave way to rougher terrain with small canyons and rocky hills, when he heard something that made him pull his horse to a stop and sit perfectly still, straining to hear more clearly. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, the sound of children crying, small voices calling for help, sounds so unexpected in this empty country that Joe's first thought was that he must be imagining them, that isolation had finally driven him to hallucination. But the sounds continued, and they came from a specific direction over a rise about 200 yards to his left, and Joe turned his horse that way, moving slowly, still half convinced he would find nothing but his mind playing tricks on him. As he crested the rise, he saw below him a sight that drove all thoughts of hallucination from his mind and replaced them with immediate alarm and concern. At the bottom of a shallow ravine lay an overturned wagon, one wheel completely broken off, supplies scattered across the ground, 2 horses nowhere to be seen, and huddled together beside the wreckage were 2 small children, little girls who looked to be identical twins, perhaps 4 years old, dressed in clothing far too light for the dropping temperature, their faces turned upward toward Joe with expressions of hope and terror mixed together. The girls saw Joe and began crying louder, calling out for help, reaching their small arms toward him, clearly desperate for rescue from whatever disaster had left them in this situation. Joe dismounted quickly and scrambled down into the ravine, his mind racing with questions about where these children had come from and where their parents were, and how long they had been here, and what had happened to put them in this desperate situation. As he reached the girls, they immediately tried to cling to him, both talking at once in voices high with fear and cold, telling a confused story about how the wagon had tipped over, and how Mama had gone to find the horses, and told them to wait right here and not to move, and that was a long time ago. And Mama had not come back, and they were cold and scared and hungry. And where was Mama, and would he please help them? Joe felt his heart, which had been numb for so long, suddenly contract with an emotion so powerful it was almost painful, a surge of protective instinct that he had not felt since Mary's death, an overwhelming need to help these children and to find their mother, and to make this situation right somehow. He took off his heavy coat and wrapped it around both girls, holding them close to warm them with his body heat, speaking to them in a gentle voice he barely recognized as his own, telling them that he was going to help them, that everything would be all right, that he would take care of them and find their mother. Joe looked around for any sign of the children's mother, calling out loudly in case she was within earshot, but there was no response except the wind and the fading calls of birds settling for the night. He examined the area around the overturned wagon and found tracks suggesting that the horses had bolted, probably panicked by whatever had caused the wagon to overturn, and that someone, presumably the mother, had gone after them on foot heading roughly north. The tracks were several hours old based on how the edges had dried, which meant the mother had been gone for a considerable time and might be miles away by now, possibly injured or lost or worse. Joe made a quick decision, knowing that the temperature would drop below freezing as soon as the sun set, and that these little girls would not survive a night exposed to such cold. He had to get them to warmth and shelter immediately, which meant taking them to his ranch house, and then he could organize a search for their mother. He gathered the girls up, lifting one in each arm despite their combined weight being considerable, and carried them up out of the ravine to where his horse waited. He managed to mount while holding both children, settling them in front of him on the saddle, keeping his arms around them to hold them secure and to share his body warmth as he turned his horse toward home. The ride back to Joe's ranch house took nearly 2 hours because he had to move slowly to avoid jostling the children too much, and because the girls were so cold and frightened that they kept crying and asking questions about their mother that Joe could not answer. He talked to them continuously during the ride, asking their names and learning that they were called Emma and Eliza, asking about their mother and learning her name was Catherine, asking where they had been traveling and learning that they were heading to a homestead near Copper Bend, where Catherine's brother was supposed to be waiting for them, though the girls did not know exactly where that was or how far they had been from their destination when the accident happened. By the time Joe's ranch house came into view, full darkness had fallen and the temperature had dropped sharply, the cold biting at any exposed skin and making the horse's breath fog in the air. Joe urged his mount faster over the final stretch, desperate to get the children inside to warmth before the cold did them real harm. He dismounted awkwardly with the girls still in his arms, carried them into the house, and immediately built up the fire in the main room until it was blazing, providing heat that the children desperately needed. Joe wrapped the girls in blankets and sat them close to the fire, and only then, with them safe and warming up, did he really look at them carefully for the first time. Emma and Eliza were indeed identical twins, with dark curly hair and large brown eyes and small delicate features that were beautiful despite being streaked with dirt and tears. Their clothing was worn but had been carefully mended, suggesting a mother who took pride in her children's appearance even when resources were limited. The girls were exhausted and frightened but not injured, and as they warmed up, they began to relax slightly, their crying subsiding into occasional hiccups and sniffles. Joe realized the children must be desperately hungry, and he set about preparing food, which for him usually meant simple fare like beans or salt pork or whatever required minimal cooking skill. But for these little girls, he tried to do better, warming milk and making porridge sweetened with a bit of precious sugar he kept for rare occasions, offering food in small amounts because he knew that very hungry people needed to eat slowly to avoid making themselves sick. Emma and Eliza ate eagerly, their small hands clutching the bowls Joe gave them, their eyes watching him with a mixture of gratitude and lingering wariness. As the girls ate and warmed and gradually stopped shaking from cold and fear, Joe found himself talking to them more than he had talked to anyone in years, asking questions and telling them stories, and doing his best to distract them from their worry about their mother and from the strangeness of their situation. He learned that their father had died from fever several months earlier, that their mother was bringing them west to live with their uncle who had a homestead near Copper Bend, that they had been traveling for weeks, that Catherine had been driving the wagon herself because she could not afford to hire a driver. As the evening wore on and exhaustion overtook the girls despite their worry about their mother, Joe created makeshift beds for them on the floor near the fire, piling blankets to create nests of warmth and safety. Emma and Eliza insisted on sleeping right next to each other, holding hands even in sleep, and Joe found himself watching them with emotions he could barely name, a mixture of tenderness and protectiveness and a deep ache, because these children reminded him painfully of the son he had never gotten to hold, the family he had almost had before death took it away. Joe sat up most of that night, keeping the fire built up so the house stayed warm, watching over the sleeping children, thinking about their mother Catherine, who was somewhere out there in the freezing night, possibly injured, possibly lost, possibly dead. He knew he would have to organize a search party at first light, would have to ride to neighboring ranches to gather men who could help look for her, would have to explain how he had found these children and convince people to help him search for a woman they did not know. The thought of dealing with people, of having to talk and coordinate and interact after so many years of isolation, filled Joe with anxiety. But he knew he had no choice, because those little girls needed their mother, and because no decent person could leave someone to die in the wilderness if there was any chance of finding them alive. As dawn broke cold and clear, Joe was preparing to leave the children with what little food he could set out for them and ride to the nearest neighbor to begin organizing a search, when he heard the sound of a horse approaching his house. He moved quickly to the window, hoping it was a neighbor who could help, and what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. A woman was riding toward his house, slumped over her horse's neck, barely staying in the saddle, her clothing torn and dirty, her face pale with exhaustion. Even from a distance, Joe could see that this was someone who had reached the absolute limit of human endurance and was continuing forward on nothing but desperate will. Joe rushed outside as the woman reached his yard, arriving just in time to catch her as she began to slide from the saddle, too weak to dismount properly. She was mumbling through cracked lips about her babies, about Emma and Eliza, about needing to find them, about the wagon accident, her words tumbling over each other in confusion, but her meaning absolutely clear. Joe told her quickly that her children were safe inside, that he had found them yesterday and had brought them here, that they were warm and fed and sleeping peacefully. And he saw the woman's face transform, saw relief so powerful it seemed to light her from within despite her obvious exhaustion and pain. Joe helped the woman, who confirmed her name was Catherine, into the house, supporting her weight because her legs were barely functioning. As they entered the main room, Emma and Eliza, who had just woken up, saw their mother and began screaming with joy, running to her on their small legs, crying out "Mama, Mama," with voices filled with relief and love. Catherine collapsed to her knees and pulled both girls into her arms, holding them tight, crying and laughing at the same time, checking them frantically to make sure they were truly all right, kissing their faces and murmuring words of love and relief. Joe stood back and watched this reunion, feeling his throat tighten with emotions he had kept locked away for so long, witnessing the raw power of a mother's love for her children and the children's love for their mother, seeing the fear and grief of separation transform instantly into the joy of reunion. After several minutes during which Catherine simply held her daughters and cried while they clung to her, she looked up at Joe with eyes that shone with gratitude and tears, and she thanked him in a voice rough with emotion, telling him that he had saved her babies, that she could never repay such a debt, that he had given her back the only things in the world that mattered to her. Joe, uncomfortable with gratitude and emotion, told Catherine gruffly that any decent person would have done the same, that he had just been in the right place at the right time, that she did not owe him anything. But even as he said these words, he was seeing Catherine clearly for the first time, seeing a woman perhaps in her late 20s with dark hair similar to her daughter's, and a face that would have been beautiful if not drawn with exhaustion and hardship. More than her appearance, Joe saw in her eyes a strength and determination that resonated with something deep in him, a recognition that this was someone who had endured terrible things but had not been broken by them, who had fought her way through a freezing night to find her children, because giving up had simply not been an option. Catherine's story came out gradually over the next hours, as Joe insisted she rest and eat, and allow her body to recover from the ordeal she had been through. She explained that the wagon accident had happened when one wheel hit a hidden hole, and the whole vehicle had tipped over. that the horses had panicked and broken their leads and run off, that she had told Emma and Eliza to stay by the wagon while she went after the horses because she knew they could not survive without transportation. She had tracked the horses for miles, finally catching one of them, but then becoming disoriented in the rough terrain and getting lost as darkness fell. She had spent the night huddled against her horse for warmth, and at dawn had climbed a high point and spotted smoke from Joe's chimney in the distance, and had ridden toward that smoke on nothing but hope and desperation, praying that whoever lived there might have found her children. Catherine and her daughter stayed at Joe's ranch house that day, and the next night because Catherine was simply too exhausted to travel, and because the children needed continued rest and good food to fully recover from their ordeal. Joe found himself in the strange position of having his long silent house suddenly filled with the sounds of other people, with the girls' laughter and chatter, with Catherine's softer voice as she talked to her daughters or thanked Joe repeatedly for his help. The silence that Joe had grown so accustomed to was shattered completely, and he discovered to his surprise that instead of resenting this intrusion, he found himself treasuring it, finding that the house felt more alive than it had in 7 years. Joe observed Catherine carefully over those 2 days, watching how she interacted with her daughters, seeing the patience she showed even when exhausted, the love that infused every word and gesture, the strength that allowed her to function despite having lost a husband and having nearly lost her children, and having survived an ordeal that would have destroyed weaker people. He found himself drawn to her in ways that both excited and frightened him, felt stirrings of attraction and connection that he had thought died with Mary, began to imagine possibilities that seemed both wonderful and terrifying. Catherine, for her part, was observing Joe with equal attention, seeing beneath his gruff exterior and his obvious discomfort with company to the fundamental decency and kindness that had driven him to save her children and to open his home to strangers. She saw that he was lonely, that his house showed signs of years without a woman's touch, that he moved through space like someone who had forgotten what it meant to truly live rather than just exist. She felt gratitude, certainly, but also curiosity and a growing sense of connection to this man who had appeared in her family's darkest hour like an answer to prayers. She had barely had time to speak. The practical matters of Catherine's situation had to be addressed. She explained to Joe that she had been traveling to her brother's homestead near Copper Bend, that her brother Daniel had written to her after her husband's death and had invited her to come west where he would help her establish herself, and where her daughters could grow up in open country with opportunity. But Catherine did not know exactly where Daniel's homestead was beyond general directions, and she had no wagon now to carry her belongings or to travel in, and her money was almost gone after weeks of travel and unexpected expenses. Joe offered to ride into Copper Bend to ask about Daniel and to help Catherine locate him, and Catherine accepted this offer with more gratitude, though Joe could see worry in her eyes about what would happen if Daniel could not be found, or if the homestead did not exist, or if some other complication arose. Joe made the ride to Copper Bend the next morning, leaving Catherine and the girls at his ranch house, and he spent several hours in town asking questions and searching for information about someone named Daniel who had a homestead in the area. The news Joe brought back was not good. He had found people who knew of Daniel, but he had learned that Daniel had died from a farming accident nearly 3 months earlier, that his homestead had been claimed by the bank for unpaid debts, that there was no brother waiting to help Catherine establish herself in Montana. Joe delivered this news to Catherine as gently as he could, watching her face as hope transformed into despair, seeing her struggle to maintain composure in front of her daughters, witnessing the exact moment when she realized that she had traveled for weeks to reach a destination that no longer existed, that she was alone in a strange territory with no resources and no plan and no idea what to do next. That evening, after Emma and Eliza had fallen asleep, Joe and Catherine sat at the table in the main room and talked honestly about her situation and her options, which were painfully limited. Catherine had almost no money left, no wagon, no possessions beyond what she had been wearing, and the few items salvaged from the accident. She could not afford train fare back east even if she wanted to return to where she had come from, which she did not because there was nothing waiting for her there except harder memories and fewer opportunities. She could try to find work in Copper Bend, but opportunities for women with children were scarce and poorly paid, and Catherine was realistic about the difficulty of supporting herself and two daughters on what she could earn from washing or cooking or other available labor. Joe listened to Catherine's assessment of her situation, and then he did something that surprised him even as the words left his mouth. He told Catherine that she and her daughters could stay at his ranch if she wanted, that he had more space than he needed, and that his house could use a woman's touch, that in exchange for her help managing the household he would provide shelter and food and security for her family. He made clear he was not proposing marriage or anything improper, just a practical arrangement where she would work as his housekeeper in exchange for room and board for herself and her daughters. Catherine looked at Joe with searching eyes, clearly trying to understand his motives and to assess whether his offer was genuine or whether there were expectations he was not stating openly. She asked him directly why he would make such an offer to strangers, what he wanted from her beyond housekeeping, whether he understood that accepting would mean taking on responsibility for two small children who would be noisy and messy and demanding. Joe answered honestly that his motives were not entirely selfless, that his house had become unbearable in its silence and emptiness, that having other people there had reminded him that life could be more than just working until you died, that he thought the arrangement would benefit everyone involved, but that she should feel free to refuse if she was uncomfortable with anything he was proposing. Catherine was quiet for a long time, clearly wrestling with this decision, weighing her desperate need against her instinct to protect her daughters and herself, trying to judge Joe's character based on the limited time she had known him. Finally, she told Joe that she would accept his offer on a trial basis, that they would try the arrangement for 6 months and see if it worked for everyone, and that either party could end the arrangement during that period if it proved unsatisfactory. Joe agreed to these terms immediately, feeling relief in something else, something that felt like hope stirring in a place he had thought was dead forever. The months that followed Catherine and her daughters moving permanently into Joe's ranch house brought changes that transformed not just the physical space, but the entire atmosphere of the property and the lives of everyone involved. Catherine threw herself into managing the household with energy and skill born from years of making do with limited resources, cleaning and organizing and cooking meals that were far superior to anything Joe had eaten in years. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring and began preserving food for winter. She sewed curtains and made cushions, and added small touches that turned the house from a shelter into a home. Emma and Eliza brought life and noise and laughter to a property that had been silent for too long, filling the yard with their games and the house with their chatter and questions, and the particular chaos that small children create wherever they go. Joe found himself drawn into their world almost against his will, finding that it was impossible to maintain emotional distance from two little girls who insisted on showing him every interesting rock they found, and who wanted him to lift them onto his horse, and who asked endless questions about everything they saw. He began teaching them about the ranch, showing them how to feed chickens and how to recognize different plants and how to stay safe around large animals, becoming without quite realizing it the father figure they had lost when their own father died. The relationship between Joe and Catherine evolved slowly over those months from employer and employee to something deeper and more complex, built on daily cooperation and growing respect, and the recognition that they worked well together, and that their lives fit together in ways that seemed natural rather than forced. They talked in the evenings after the girls went to bed, sharing stories about their pasts and their thoughts about life and their observations about the world, building the foundation of genuine friendship that could support something more if both chose to pursue it. The community reaction to the arrangement was predictably mixed, with some people viewing it as scandalous for an unmarried man and woman to be living under the same roof, even with the presence of children, while others saw it as a practical solution to two people's needs. But as months passed, and as people saw that the household was functioning well, and that Catherine and her daughters were thriving, and that Joe seemed happier than anyone had seen him in years, even the critics gradually accepted the situation as unusual but respectable. About 10 months after Catherine and her daughters had come to live at Joe's ranch, on a spring evening when the air was soft and the prairie flowers were blooming, Joe asked Catherine to marry him in a halting proposal that acknowledged his flaws and his past grief, but that expressed genuine love and commitment and hope for a future together. Catherine accepted without hesitation, telling Joe that she had come to love him not despite his struggles, but because of how he had worked through them, that she believed they could build something good together, that she wanted her daughters to grow up with him as their father, and that she wanted him to be her partner in all things. They married in a simple ceremony in Copper Bend, with Emma and Eliza serving as flower girls, and with several neighbors attending as witnesses to the union. The marriage changed some aspects of their household, but preserved the essential dynamics that had proven successful, creating a family that was built on choice and commitment rather than just circumstance. The years that followed saw Joe and Catherine's family flourish in ways that blessed everyone involved. Emma and Eliza grew up secure and loved, knowing both their birth father's memory and their stepfather's daily devotion, understanding that family could be created through choice and love rather than just through blood. Joe and Catherine had two more children together, a son named Thomas and a daughter named Mary, expanding their family and deepening the bonds that held them together. Joe's ranch prospered under their combined efforts, with Catherine's management and Joe's labor creating an operation that was more successful than either could have achieved alone. But more than material success, what they built was a home filled with love and laughter and the ordinary chaos and joy of family life, proving that second chances are real and that broken hearts can heal when given reason to love again. The story of how Joe had found two lost little girls and how their mother's arrival had transformed his life became a tale told throughout the region, an example of how Providence works in mysterious ways, how a simple act of kindness can return blessings beyond measure, how the loneliest souls can find salvation through opening their hearts to others. Emma and Eliza, as they grew older, understood that their childhood ordeal had led to something beautiful, that the night they spent lost and frightened had been the beginning of their real family, that Joe had saved them and their mother had saved him, and together they had created something none of them could have built alone. In the harsh territory of frontier Montana, where survival required luck as much as skill, and where loneliness was a danger as real as any physical threat, the story of Joe Carter and Catherine, and the twin girls he saved, stands as powerful testimony to how lives can change direction in a single moment, and how the greatest blessings often come disguised as disasters. Joe Carter had been drifting toward a slow death of the spirit, maintaining his body but letting his soul starve in isolation that seemed safe, but was actually killing him by inches. The discovery of those two frightened children broke through the walls he had built around his heart, reminded him that he was capable of feeling and caring and connecting with others, gave him a reason to re-engage with life rather than just enduring it. Catherine had been traveling toward what she thought was security, only to discover that her plan had fallen apart, that the brother she was counting on was dead, that she was alone in a strange place with no resources and no options. But what seemed like the final disaster turned out to be the doorway to a future better than anything she had been hoping for, proving that sometimes our carefully made plans need to fail so that something better can emerge from the ruins. Together, Joe and Catherine built a family that neither had expected but that both desperately needed, a partnership that transformed loneliness into belonging, that turned grief into joy, that proved broken people can help each other heal, and that love is not diminished by being second love, but rather is enriched by the wisdom that comes from having survived loss and having learned to value what you have while you have it. The wild frontier demanded much from those who lived there, but it also offered possibilities for reinvention and second chances that more settled places did not allow. Joe's story reminds us that saving others is often how we save ourselves, that opening our homes and hearts to those in need is not just charity but wisdom, that the family we create through choice and commitment can be as strong as any family built through blood and tradition. The legacy Joe and Catherine left through their children and grandchildren, and through the example of their lives together, continues to resonate, teaching that loneliness need not be permanent, that tragedy need not be the end of the story, that two lost little girls crying in the wilderness can be the beginning of something beautiful and lasting, and that sometimes what seems like the worst day of your life is actually the first day of something better than you ever imagined possible.